Imagine a world where your deepest fears about divine judgment could become a public spectacle, where your every misstep, real or imagined, was weighed not just by your conscience, but by an entire community, under the watchful eyes of powerful religious leaders. What if, in 890, this weight bore down disproportionately, unfairly, on half of the population? Number 1. The burden of spiritual interpretation and patriarchal judgment. Step into the year 890 AD. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, the murmur of Latin prayers, and the unyielding certainty of divine judgment. In this world, dominated by faith, the church is not just a building or a concept. It is the very framework of daily life, its teachings shaping every breath, every thought, every transgression. And central to this framework is the idea of penance, a journey of atonement, a rigorous path to cleansing the soul of sin and earning divine forgiveness. For both men and women, penance was a daunting prospect, often involving fasting, almsgiving, prayer, and sometimes public humiliation. Yet, for women, this spiritual journey was rarely a straightforward path toward grace. Instead, it was often a winding road, paved with additional challenges, interpreted through a lens that amplified their vulnerability and minimized their agency. One of the most insidious burdens placed upon women during penance in 890 AD was the absolute and undeniable reality of spiritual interpretation and patriarchal judgment. Think about it. Your deepest secrets, your most private thoughts, your very spiritual essence were laid bare before a male confessor, a priest whose understanding of your soul, your sins, and your path to redemption was shaped by a worldview that considered women inherently weaker, more susceptible to sin, and often more carnal. How could an unbiased, truly compassionate spiritual guidance emerge from such a power dynamic? The answer for many women was that it simply could not consider the role of the confessor. In 890, and indeed for centuries to come, confession was a crucial step in the penitential process. It was the moment when a sinner confessed their transgressions, sought absolution, and received instruction on the penance required for atonement. For women, this act was fraught with layers of complexity. Their sins, particularly those related to sexuality, marriage, or even motherhood, were often seen through a distinctly male theological prism. Historical accounts and surviving penitential manuals from the era, like the Penitential of Theodore, or those compiled by Rabanus Maurus, reveal detailed lists of sins and their prescribed penances. While some penances were universal, many were specifically tailored, or at least interpreted, in ways that disproportionately affected women. Take, for instance, sins related to sexual transgression. While lust was condemned for both men and women, the culpability and the resulting penance often fell heavier on the woman. She was frequently seen as the temptress, the Eve figure, whose allure led men astray. A man's lust might be treated as a moment of weakness, but a woman's perceived promiscuity, or even just a perceived immodesty, could invite far harsher judgment and more severe penance. She might be subjected to longer fasts, more stringent periods of celibacy, or public shaming that stripped her of her good name and social standing. Records from monastic archives sometimes hint at cases where women accused of adultery or fornication faced years of rigorous penance, while their male partners might receive comparatively lighter sentences or even escape significant public censure entirely. This imbalance wasn't just unfair, it was a deeply ingrained societal bias masquerading as divine justice. Furthermore, the very nature of what constituted a sin for a woman was often interpreted through a male lens, leading to penances that reinforced existing gender hierarchies. Were you a woman who spoke too boldly in the assembly? Did you fail to obey your husband promptly? Did you struggle with childbearing, perhaps implying divine displeasure? These were not just personal failings. They could be deemed spiritual transgressions requiring penance. A woman's spiritual journey was frequently a lesson in humility, obedience, and self-abasement, prescribed by men who believed these were her natural virtues. Penance wasn't just about cleansing sin. It was also about conforming to a prescribed ideal of womanhood, an ideal shaped by men for men. Imagine a woman named Elara living in a small village in Francia during this time. Perhaps she had a sharp tongue, a fiery spirit that chafed under the strictures of her husband or the local priest. She might be accused of a sign of pride or disobedience. Her penance might involve long periods of silence, forced acts of public submission, or even specific prayers designed to humble her spirit and break her will. A man displaying similar characteristics, however, might be seen as strong-willed, a leader perhaps needing a different kind of penance, one that did not aim to extinguish his innate personality. The spiritual guidance was not tailored to individual spiritual growth as much as it was to gendered expectations. This patriarchal judgment extended even to the most intimate aspects of a woman's life, including her reproductive experiences. Childbirth in the 9th century was perilous. Infant mortality was tragically high. For a woman who lost a child, especially if she herself survived, there could be an undercurrent of guilt, a whisper that perhaps her sin, known or unknown, had brought about this tragedy. While the Church offered solace, some spiritual advisors, driven by their own interpretations of divine will, might suggest penances for the grieving mother, not for her grief, but for some perceived failing that led to the sorrow. Could a miscarriage be seen as a sign of divine displeasure? Could a difficult birth be interpreted as punishment for a secret sin? These questions, however, implicitly could lead to further spiritual burdens on women already suffering immense emotional and physical pain. Moreover, the male clergy's interpretation of female spirituality itself was often reductionist. They frequently focused on a woman's role as mother and wife, or as a cloistered nun, with little understanding or acknowledgement of other forms of female experience or spiritual seeking. A woman who felt a calling outside these roles might find her spiritual aspirations misunderstood or even deemed suspicious. Her desire for theological knowledge, for example, might be seen as pride or an attempt to usurp male authority, leading to penances designed to rein her in rather than encourage her spiritual growth. The path to enlightenment for women was often narrowed, fenced in by male interpretations of divine will and human nature. The very concept of female spiritual impurity, derived from Old Testament prescriptions regarding menstruation and childbirth, while mitigated somewhat by Christian theology, still cast a long shadow. While no longer strictly binding in Christian practice, the echoes of such ideas could subtly influence how a confessor viewed a woman's body and its natural processes. This subtle bias could lead to unacknowledged psychological burdens, where women might internalize feelings of inherent spiritual unworthiness simply due to their biological reality, adding another layer of anxiety to their penitential journey. In essence, the burden of spiritual interpretation and patriarchal judgment was a pervasive force that shaped every aspect of a woman's penance in 890 AD. It meant that her path to atonement was not solely between her and God, but filtered through the biases and societal norms held by male spiritual authorities. It meant that her sins were often weighed differently, her virtues redefined, and her very essence as a spiritual being framed within a narrow, male-defined understanding. This wasn't just about harsh rules, it was about the fundamental control over a woman's spiritual narrative, a control that often left her feeling disempowered and unfairly judged, even as she sought divine grace. Path to salvation. For women was frequently not a path of liberation, but one of stricter conformity, dictated by those who held the keys to spiritual absolution, keys shaped by centuries of male dominance. Number 2. The burden of severed familial and social bonds. Imagine a world where your entire identity, your very security, your place in the community, is interwoven with the tapestry of your family. In 890, and this was not just a social norm, it was the bedrock of existence. Life was precarious. Survival often depended on collective effort, and the family unit, whether extended kin, a household of servants, or the nuclear structure, provided the fundamental safety net against a harsh and unforgiving world. Now, imagine that for the sake of religious penance, this fundamental safety net, these vital connections, could be deliberately, brutally severed. For women, this wasn't just a challenge. It was often a unique and devastating burden, leaving them vulnerable, exposed, and stripped of their most crucial support systems. Consider the societal role of women in 890 AD. A woman's standing was almost inextricably linked to her familial position, as a daughter, a wife, a mother, or a widow. Her economic security, her social protection, her very reputation often stemmed from her relationship to the men in her family, her father, her husband, her sons. She might manage the household, raise children, engage in domestic production, or even oversee farm labor. But her authority and respect were typically derived from her position within the family structure. The idea of an independent woman, socially or economically, was almost unthinkable. So, what happened when Penance demanded that these vital familial and social bonds be broken? One of the most profound aspects of this burden was the enforced separation from children. If a woman's penance required her to enter a monastery, even for a temporary period of spiritual purification, it meant leaving her children, perhaps for months or even years. In a time of high infant and child mortality, this separation carried immense emotional weight and practical danger. Could a child, particularly an infant, who relied entirely on its mother's milk, survive without her? Could older children thrive without a mother's guidance and care, especially if the father was absent or ill-equipped to manage the household on his own? While men might also leave their families for monastic life or pilgrimages, this ideal expectation of a woman's primary role as a caregiver and nurturer meant her absence created a vacuum that was often impossible to fill, leading to profound distress for both mother and child. Accounts, though sparse from this period, hint at the anguish of mothers separated from their offspring, a pain that transcended mere spiritual discipline. Then there was the abandonment by a spouse or the forced dissolution of a marriage. While rare, extreme penance could sometimes demand this. If a woman's sin was deemed particularly egregious, or if her husband was pressured by the church to distance himself from her perceived corruption, she could find herself cast out from her marital home, effectively becoming a social pariah. In a society where a woman's legitimacy and protection largely came through her husband, being divorced or abandoned under such circumstances meant immediate and utter destitution. She would have no property, no legal standing, and no social safety net. Her reputation would be shattered, making it impossible to remarry or find respectable employment. She might be forced to wander as a beggar or seek refuge in the poorest almshouses, her once secure place in the community irrevocably lost. Such severance of bonds was not just about spiritual cleansing, it was about the absolute destruction of a woman's earthly existence. Even without full separation, the social ostracism that accompanied penance could be devastating. Public penance often involved wearing distinctive clothing, being barred from certain communal rituals, or even being forced to stand at the church door, soliciting alms and showing humility for anyone. This was humiliating. But for a woman whose social standing was intimately tied to her family's honor and her own reputation for piety and virtue, this public shaming could cause an irreparable rupture in her social fabric. Friends might avoid her, neighbors whisper, and her family might feel compelled to distance themselves from her to preserve their own standing. The social bonds that provided comfort, support, and a sense of belonging were frayed, often beyond repair. Imagine being a woman in a small, close-knit village, suddenly treated as an outcast, unable to participate in the gossip at the well, excluded from the communal meals, shunned by those you had known your entire life. This social death could precede any physical one. Furthermore, consider the loss of protection. In 890, women, especially those without male kin, were acutely vulnerable to violence, exploitation, and destitution. The familial unit provided a shield. When penance severed these ties, a woman was left exposed. She might face the threat of physical assault, particularly if she was forced to wander or live on the margins of society. She might be exploited for labor, offered meager wages, or simply preyed upon by unscrupulous individuals. The Church, while offering spiritual guidance, rarely provided comprehensive physical or economic protection for women who had been stripped of their social safety nets by the very process of penance. Isolation imposed by penance did not just mean loneliness. It meant profound danger, even for women who undertook penance within the confines of a monastery. The severance of bonds was acute. While monastic life offered a new communal structure, it meant a complete break from her former life, her family, and her previous identity. For some, this was a conscious choice, a path to spiritual devotion. But for others, it might have been a penance imposed upon them, a forced withdrawal from the world they knew, leaving behind relationships that they cherished. The spiritual discipline was compounded by the profound emotional and social cost of losing all that was familiar and beloved. Chronicles and hagiographies of the time, while often glorifying asceticism, occasionally reveal glimpses of the human cost of such separations, stories of women who, despite their piety, longed for their children, or who endured years of isolation with quiet dignity, speak to the immense personal sacrifices made. These were not just abstract spiritual exercises. They were deeply personal trials that irrevocably altered the course of a woman's life, tearing her away from the very people and institutions that defined her existence and provided her with security. In essence, the burden of severed familial and social bonds for women during penance in 890 AD was a multifaceted ordeal. It meant the potential loss of children, the dissolution of marriage, public ostracism, and the removal of crucial protection in a dangerous world. It was a burden that disproportionately affected women because their social standing and security were so tightly interwoven with their familial relationships. While penance aimed to cleanse the soul, for women it often came at the price of their earthly identity, leaving them to navigate a hostile world alone, their most vital connections irrevocably broken, and their very existence threatened by the lack of the social support they had once known. Number 3. The burden of economic ruin and bidi. Picture this. In 890, life was hardscrabble for most people. There was no welfare system, no modern banking, and no concept of social security. Your livelihood depended on the land, on your labor, and often on the collective efforts of your family or community. Property was wealth, even if it was just a small plot of land or a few livestock. Now imagine undergoing a period of intense religious penance. For many, this spiritual journey was not just about internal struggle. It carried immense material consequences. For women, already navigating a world with limited economic rights and opportunities, the demands of penance could swiftly lead to absolute economic ruin and crushing dependency. A burden that was often far more severe than for their male counterparts. Let us consider the economic realities for women in the Carolingian era. While women played indispensable roles in the agrarian economy, managing households, spinning yarn, weaving cloth, cultivating gardens, tending animals, and often assisting in field labor, their control over significant property was often tenuous. Dower rights existed, allowing widows to inherit a portion of their deceased husband's property. But outright ownership of land or substantial movable wealth was more common for men. Daughters often received dowries upon marriage, which then became part of the husband's domain. A single woman, or a woman without male kin, was in an especially precarious position, her economic survival dependent on her own labor or the charity of others. Penance, particularly for grave sins, often involved prescribed acts of charity, almsgiving, or even the forfeiture of property. For a wealthy landowner, a man who possessed vast estates donating a portion of his wealth to the church or to the poor, while significant, might not lead to his total impoverishment. He would likely retain enough land and resources to continue his livelihood, albeit perhaps with a reduced fortune. For a woman, however, the stakes were profoundly different. Imagine a woman named Gisela, a widow, who by virtue of her dower rights controlled a small farm, just enough to sustain herself and her 2 young children. If she committed a sin that required rigorous penance, say a public confession of adultery, or a serious breach of church law, her penance might demand significant almsgiving. Perhaps she was compelled to donate a portion of her harvest, or even sell a precious cow to demonstrate her penitence and humility. While these acts were spiritually commendable for Gisela, they directly translated into less food for her children, less milk to sell, less manure for her fields. Penance that demanded a year of strict fasting might also mean a year of weakened physical capacity, rendering her unable to perform the strenuous labor necessary to maintain her farm, pushing her closer to the brink of destitution. Furthermore, some forms of penance involve withdrawal from society, or a prohibition on engaging in certain economic activities. If a woman was confined to her home or forced to enter a cloister for a period of penance, she was immediately cut off from her productive labor. For a male farmer, his sons or male laborers might take over his duties. For a woman, whose daily labor was often the very engine of household production, her absence could bring the household economy to a grinding halt. Without her labor, who would spin the wool into thread for clothing? Who would prepare the daily meals? Who would tend the kitchen garden that provided vital sustenance? The ripples of her economic inactivity could spread throughout her household, threatening not just her own survival but that of her dependents. Consider the severe penances that might require a woman to shed her worldly possessions and embrace a life of poverty, either temporarily or permanently. While this was a path to spiritual purity for some, for many women, it was a forced descent into abject poverty. If a woman possessed a small dowry or some inherited jewels, these might be demanded as part of her penance, to be given to the church or distributed to the poor. Once gone, these assets were almost impossible to recover. She would be left with nothing, fully reliant on charity, often from the very church that had orchestrated her economic stripping. This wasn't just a reduction in wealth. It was the systematic dismantling of her financial security, leaving her vulnerable to hunger, homelessness, and exploitation. The long-term dependency created by such penances was a particularly heavy burden. A man, even if he lost some property, might have more avenues for recovery. He might be able to find new work, or his familial connections might still offer a path to rebuilding his economic standing. For a woman, particularly one whose reputation was tarnished by penance, opportunities were scarce. She might be unable to marry if she was single or widowed, thereby losing access to a husband's economic support. Her past penance could make her unmarriageable, further entrenching her poverty. She might be forced into menial labor or become a permanent recipient of alms, her life forever shaped by the economic consequences of her atonement. Surviving records, such as those detailing land transfers to monasteries as part of pious donations or penances, sometimes indicate that women, especially widows, were pressured to give up their limited assets in exchange for spiritual favors or as atonement for sins. While the spiritual benefit was touted, the practical outcome was often total economic ruin for the woman and her dependents. They transitioned from struggling independence to complete reliance on monastic charity, a charity that was often grudgingly given and carried the stigma of their former sins. In essence, the burden of economic ruin and dependency during penance in 890 AD was a stark reality for many women. It amplified their existing economic viabilities, transforming spiritual discipline into material devastation. While men of means might weather the storm of forfeiture, women with their more limited property rights and fewer avenues for independent income found themselves stripped bare, plunged into destitution, and condemned to a life of perpetual dependence. This wasn't just a side effect of penance, it was, for many women, a primary and enduring consequence, leaving them with nothing but the spiritual hope of salvation and the crushing reality of an empty purse and an uncertain future. Number 4. The burden of physical changeability and unacknowledged needs. Imagine a world where your body's natural rhythms, its undeniable needs, its unique vulnerabilities, were not just ignored, but actively seen as hindrances to spiritual purity. In 890, when religious penance often involved extreme ascetic practices, this was a daily reality for many women. Fasting, long vigils, exposure to cold, lack of sleep, and arduous physical tasks were common demands of penance for everyone seeking atonement. Yet for women, these demands carried an additional silent burden: the profound disregard for their distinct physiological needs, which could turn a spiritual quest into a harrowing and sometimes life-threatening ordeal. Consider the female body in the 9th century. Pregnancy was a frequent state for married women, and childbirth a regular dangerous event. Lactation followed, often for years, demanding immense caloric intake and physical resilience. And then there was menstruation, a monthly reality that, in this era, was often shrouded in misunderstanding and even viewed with suspicion by some theological perspectives. Against this backdrop, the general prescriptions for penance, largely formulated by male clergy with little direct experience of female physiology, were applied with a stark uniformity that ignored these crucial distinctions. Take fasting, for example. It was a cornerstone of penance. Days, sometimes weeks, of abstaining from food or surviving on meager rations of bread and water were common. For a man, even a difficult fast might be endurable, perhaps leading to weakness and hunger, but typically not to catastrophic health outcomes. For a pregnant woman, however, such a fast could jeopardize not only her own health, but the very life of the unborn child. Malnutrition during pregnancy could lead to miscarriages, stillbirths, or the birth of severely underweight and vulnerable infants. Yet the spiritual dictates of penance rarely made allowances for this vital biological reality. The emphasis was on spiritual suffering, not physical well-being. Similarly, consider a woman who was lactating. A nursing mother required substantial nourishment to produce milk and sustain her own strength. Demanding severe fasting from her would not only deprive her of energy, but would also directly impact her ability to feed her infant, potentially condemning the child to starvation or severe malnutrition. Penance, meant for her own soul, could thus have devastating, even fatal consequences for the innocent life dependent upon her. Did the priests, in their spiritual zeal, consider the weeping infant when prescribing weeks of bread and water for a new mother? Historical records and the penitential literature rarely show such nuanced considerations. The physical needs of the mother, and by extension the child, were often subsumed by the overarching demand for spiritual rigor. Then there was the reality of menstruation. While the New Testament largely moved away from Old Testament ritual purity laws, lingering cultural and theological notions sometimes associated menstruation with a form of impurity, or at least weakness. While a woman was not typically barred from church during menstruation, the physical discomforts, the cramping, the fatigue, the blood loss were undeniable. When penance demanded long vigils, kneeling for hours on cold stone floors, or engaging in strenuous physical labor, these demands became significantly more arduous for a woman experiencing her monthly cycle. The physical toll was amplified, yet her suffering was often unacknowledged, viewed merely as another part of the spiritual trial, rather than a physiological reality that merited practical consideration or modified expectation. Beyond these specific reproductive and cyclical realities, penance often involved general physical hardship. Many penances required periods of living in solitude, sometimes in rudimentary shelters, exposed to the elements. For a woman whose physical strength might naturally differ from a man's, or who might be recovering from childbirth, this exposure to cold, damp, and privation could lead to serious illness. A woman, weakened by repeated pregnancies and the relentless toil of daily life, might find the additional strain of penance pushing her body beyond its limits, leading to chronic illness, a shortened lifespan, or even death. Accounts from the era speak of the devout who withered away from their ascetic practices. And while some were celebrated as martyrs of piety for women, it often meant a quiet, unacknowledged demise hastened by demands that overlooked their inherent physical fragility. The very concept of the body was often viewed differently for women by the male ecclesiastical authorities. The female body was at times seen as a source of temptation, a vessel of sin, or inherently weaker and more prone to corruption. This will-do meant that physical suffering, particularly for women, could be viewed as a necessary purification, a way to subdue the sinful flesh. There was less emphasis on preserving physical health and more on breaking the body's will to liberate the spirit. This philosophical approach, while universal in some aspects of monasticism, had a particularly severe impact on women whose bodies faced unique and demanding biological processes that were often dismissed as secondary to spiritual concern. Even if a woman was not pregnant or lactating, the constant cycle of childbirth and the relentless demands of household management, coupled with inadequate nutrition and hygiene, meant that many women in 890 AD lived in a state of chronic fatigue and compromised health. Imposing rigorous penances such as prolonged kneeling, extensive pilgrimages on foot, or severe dietary restrictions on bodies already weakened by life's relentless demands was not just difficult, it was often cruelly indifferent to the realities of female physical endurance. In sum, the burden of physical vulnerability and unacknowledged needs was a silent but pervasive force impacting women during penance in 890. The spiritual zeal of the era, coupled with a patriarchal framework that often disregarded female physiology, meant that penances replied uniformly without due consideration or the general toll of a woman's life in a pre-modern world. This oversight transformed acts of spiritual devotion into severe physical trials, often compromising a woman's health, endangering her unborn or nursing children, and forcing her to endure suffering that went far beyond the spiritual discomfort intended. Number 5. The burden of amplified shame and public scrutiny. Step into the central square of a medieval town in 890. The air hums with the everyday sounds of commerce and community, but also with an undercurrent of watchful piety. Reputation is everything. Honor is guarded fiercely. And when a transgression occurs, especially a spiritual one, the community often acts as both judge and jury. While men certainly face public consequences for their sins, for women the burden of amplified shame and relentless public scrutiny during religious penance was a distinct and often annihilating experience. Their perceived missteps were not merely personal failings, they were seen as a moral stain on the entire community, demanding a visible, often brutal cleansing. Consider the prevailing societal attitudes toward women in 890. Women were largely defined by their roles within the family and by their perceived virtue, particularly chastity and piety. A woman's honor was intertwined with the honor of her father or husband. Her spiritual purity was often held up as a barometer for the moral health of the household and even the wider community. When a woman fell, especially if her sin involved sexuality, disobedience, or anything that challenged her prescribed role, it was not just a personal failing. It was often seen as a cosmic disruption, a potential source of divine wrath upon the collective. This amplified perception of female sin meant that the ensuing penance was frequently designed to be highly visible, intensely shaming, and deeply punitive to her reputation. One of the most immediate manifestations of this burden was the requirement for public confession and humiliation, while men might also be compelled to confess their sins before the community. The nature and intensity of the shame often differed for women. A woman accused of adultery, for example, might be forced to stand barefoot at the church door, dressed in sackcloth, often with her hair unbound, a symbol of her loss of modesty and control, as parishioners entered for services. Her name might be called out, her sin detailed by the priest, her very presence a living testament to her transgression. Imagine the whispers, the averted gazes, the judgmental stares from people she had known her entire life. For a man, a public penance might be a temporary setback, but for a woman, whose social currency was so tied to her good name and purity, this level of public shaming could be a social death sentence, from which there was rarely any recovery. The public scrutiny extended beyond the initial act of confession. Penance often involved wearing specific, often drab or distinctive, clothing for extended periods. This was not just about humility. It was a permanent visual marker of her penitent status, a scarlet letter of sorts, signaling to everyone she encountered that she was a sinner undergoing atonement. She might be forbidden from adorning herself, from wearing jewelry or colorful garments, reinforcing the idea that her body, having been a source of sin, must now be subdued and rendered unattractive. Every walk to the market, every interaction with a neighbor became a performative act of shame, with her clothing serving as a constant reminder of her past. This relentless visual scrutiny stripped her of her privacy and condemned her to a life under the communal gaze, a perpetual object lesson. Furthermore, the types of sins women were often publicly shamed for were rooted in deeply ingrained gender biases. Accusations of witchcraft, while terrifying for anyone, often targeted women, especially those who were old, childless, or somehow outside societal norms. If a woman was accused of dabbling in magic or pagan practices, her penance would not only involve public confession but might also include public rituals designed to purify her and the community, often involving humiliating acts of self-abasement or public denunciations. The fear of female magic was widespread, and the public shaming served as a potent deterrent, sending a chilling message to others. Even perceived sins that seemed minor could lead to disproportionate public shaming for women. A woman who gossiped excessively, or who was thought to have an overly proud demeanor, might find herself subjected to public rebuke, perhaps even being made an example of during a sermon. While a man's boisterousness might be overlooked, a woman's outspokenness could be seen as a challenge to order, demanding a public display of submission. The very act of living as a woman in 890 AD, where female behavior was so meticulously policed, meant that the path to penance was rife with opportunities for public shaming for transgressions that might be overlooked or treated more privately for men. The effect of this amplified shame was profound and long-lasting. It wasn't just about temporary discomfort, it was about the destruction of a woman's social capital. Once her reputation was publicly sullied, it was incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to regain it. She might be ostracized from social gatherings, excluded from important community rituals like weddings or baptisms, and find herself unable to participate fully in the life of her village. Marriage prospects for single women would vanish. For married women, the public shame could bring immense dishonor upon her husband and children, potentially leading to familial abandonment or permanent alienation within her own home. The ripple effect of her public penance could devastate not just her own life, but the lives of those closest to her. Think of it this way. A man's reputation, while important, was often tied to his land, his martial prowess, his political influence, or his trade. He might suffer a public setback and still recover his standing through different means. A woman's standing, however, was so inextricably linked to her moral character and purity, as defined by a patriarchal society, that a public stain on that character was often insurmountable. The very essence of her worth was publicly dismantled, leaving her with little opportunity to rebuild. In conclusion, the burden of amplified shame and public scrutiny placed upon women during religious penance in 890 AD was a cruel and disproportionate reality. It meant that their perceived sins, particularly those related to sexuality or challenging traditional gender roles, were singled out for highly visible, intensely humiliating public displays of atonement. This relentless scrutiny and public shaming, from distinctive clothing to forced confessions before the entire community, did not just punish the individual. It often irrevocably destroyed a woman's social standing, reputation, and her very place within the fabric of her community. It was a burden that lasted long after the physical penance had ended, leaving many women in a state of perpetual social exile, their lives forever marked by the public condemnation of their past.